All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the New Testament. Before we jump into the material on this session, I just want once again to highlight for you that the listener's commentary is now available on an app. So if you've had the problem of scrolling and trying to find the book you're looking for and then it not saving your location, so the next day you have to scroll again, well, the app solves that problem. You can listen by book and save your location. You can easily share with friends, download to listen offline. And so if that sounds helpful to you, just swing over to the App Store or to Google Play and download the app and use that to help you navigate easily and study the Bible here with the listener's commentary. All right, in this session, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 32. And beginning in chapter 26, Matthew has really just focused his attention now on the narrative of Jesus' death. And it's a gripping narrative as he tells it. Jesus has been arrested in the middle of the night. The Jewish authorities have interrogated Jesus throughout the night, and they concluded that he was guilty of blasphemy because he claims to be the Messiah, and they even physically assaulted him. All of that happened at the house of the high priest under the cover of darkness in the middle of the night. But an official ruling needs to be made, and if the authorities want to execute him, they're going to need the Romans to get on board with that. So now we pick up the story in the early morning hours here in chapter 27, and it reads like this. Now, when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And so what we have happening here, just as the story continues, is we have the complete gathering of the official leadership because an official pronouncement needs to be made. They have to agree on the charges that they're going to present to the Roman governor if they want to put Jesus to death. And so we have them all together here in the morning, pulling together their official document as they're going to head over to the Roman governor's place to hand Jesus over to him. And so verse 2 says, and they bound Jesus, and led him away and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Pilate was the Roman governor from about 26 to 36 AD, and officially the seat of Roman government in the region of Judea was actually in the coastal town of Caesarea, about 60 miles away from Jerusalem. But during the Passover, Pilate typically came to Jerusalem with extra troops in order to maintain order and crowd control. And so he's in Jerusalem at the governor's palace there in Jerusalem. And under Roman rule, the Romans had removed the authority of capital punishment from the Jews. And so taking Jesus to Pilate was a necessary legal step if they want to put him to death. So Matthew summarizes that, and then he pauses for just a short scene change to report how all of what was happening to Jesus is impacting Judas. So look at verse 3. Then, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Now, we don't know for sure what Judas was thinking or even what he was expecting when he handed over Jesus. What we do know is in this moment, he feels deep regret. He recognizes that what he has done is wrong in some sort of way. Notice it says that when he saw that he had been condemned, which suggests that perhaps Judas didn't expect this. I don't know what he was thinking. I don't know what he was expecting, but it seems as if he realized, oh, wow, this is not what I expected. And so now, in his remorse, he brings the 30 pieces of silver back to the leaders who had paid him to betray Jesus. And they respond to him like this, but they said, what is that to us? You shall see to it yourself. And they refuse to accept the money back. They're like, that's on you. And they won't take the money back. And so verse 5 says, he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary, and he left. And he went away and he hanged himself. And so in his deep regret, he goes and kills himself by hanging. Well, the chief priest, verse 6, took the pieces of silver and said, it's not lawful to put them in the temple treasury since it's money paid for blood. Notice that. Oh, we can't actually accept them as temple money, as like an offering, put them in the temple funds because this is blood money. And it reminds us of how easy it is to have what might be called religious righteousness, but not have real righteousness. In this case, they clearly want to do the right religious thing, but they're condemning Jesus, a clearly innocent man, as Judas himself had just said. And so they conferred together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. And so because they used blood money to buy this field, it got this nickname, Field of Blood, and it became a burial place for strangers, for outsiders, for people who weren't from Jerusalem, probably even maybe foreigners. And so we're going to use this filthy blood money for that kind of place. And verse 9 then says, that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, just as the Lord directed me. Now, it seems that this isn't an exact quote of any one passage. It's more a summary that pulls together several passages in Jeremiah as well as in Zechariah to show how these Jewish leaders are actually guilty of shedding innocent blood just like their forefathers. And so a passage like Jeremiah 19, 1 through 9, or how in Zechariah chapter 11, the shepherd of Israel, the king of Israel, is valued at a whopping 30 pieces of silver, and the money is thrown to the potter. It's those passages that are kind of pulled together in this little summary statement saying, you guys are actually just as bad off as your forefathers, killing off, getting rid of the king, the shepherd of Israel, for a measly little price of a slave, 30 pieces of silver. And that's the force of these words. Then, with that little scene change over, Matthew returns to the Jesus' trial before Governor Pilate. And so it picks up in verse 11 where it says, now Jesus stood before the governor, that is Pilate, and the governor questioned him, saying, so, you are the king of the Jews? And Jesus said to him, it is as you say. Notice that Pilate states the charge against Jesus as Jesus being the king of the Jews, that is the Messiah, which suggests what? Well, it suggests that the Jewish ruling council, when they presented their charges against him, that was the charge they passed on. That's the charge that really matters. And that's important to notice because it's going to explain why Jesus is labeled as King of the Jews on the cross. And it also is central to the theme Matthew is developing for us to help us see what is it that really got Jesus killed. And so here's the official charge. You're the King of the Jews. And why would Pilate care about that charge? Well, really two reasons. One, peace and order. That's a key role that he has to fulfill. That's actually why he's in Jerusalem at this moment for Passover. Messianic revolutionaries were well known to the Romans, and they were well known for stirring up all sorts of trouble, and it was well known that the Romans put that down with brutal violence. So peace and order, that's one reason he would care about this charge. The other reason is treason versus loyalty. Is Pilate really loyal to the true king, the emperor himself, or is he a traitor? Is he disloyal? And so he's going to care about this charge because he wants to make sure that he doesn't get viewed by anybody as being disloyal to the emperor. Now, notice that Jesus responds to him by saying, it's as you say. And once again, we see that Jesus will speak when it's about his identity. But his answer here is a bit ambiguous. Literally, he simply says, well, you say it. And it could be a form of agreement, or it could be a way of being dismissive. But with the chief priest, Jesus was perfectly clear. So why is he a little more ambiguous here? Well, probably because Jesus knows that while it's true he's the King of the Jews, it doesn't mean what everyone else thinks it means. It doesn't mean what most Jews think it means, and therefore what the Romans think the Jews think it means. And so it doesn't mean what Pilate would assume it means, and that is Jesus is not a political revolutionary. And typically when someone among the Jews claimed to be a king, that's what it meant. So Jesus states it in a way that's a little less clear here than he did to the chief priests. The story goes on in verse 12 and says, and while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he didn't answer. And so the official charge is stated. Jesus affirms that in sort of a kind of low-key sort of way, and then the chief priests start chiming in with a whole bunch of other charges, and Jesus didn't answer a word. And then Pilate said to him in verse 13, Do you not hear how many things they are testifying against you? And still, he did not answer him in regard to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Again, Jesus is in complete control of himself, and the only charge that really matters is his identity. And when that's the topic, he'll speak and affirm that indeed he is the Messiah. But with all these other charges, he just sits quiet. Now, at the Passover feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. As a little favor to the Jews, the Pilate, not like every governor, this was sort of a Pilate thing as best as we can tell from history. Pilate had this little habit of releasing a prisoner just as a favor to the Jews. And at that time, verse 16, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. It's important to pay attention how Barabbas is described and how Jesus is described in this story. So Barabbas is a notorious prisoner. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Messiah, Christ? So a notorious prisoner versus Jesus, the Messiah. And it seems as if Pilate is toying with them a little bit. I mean, even calling Jesus King, Messiah, Christ, just maybe to annoy them somewhat. Why is that? Well, look at verse 18. For he knew that it was because of envy they had handed him over to him. And so he knows that they aren't really being on the up and up. It's more out of envy and pride and selfish ambition that they're trying to get rid of Jesus, and that there's really nothing to all these charges. Even Pilate can see through the facade of their real concern and all of that. Now, only Matthew records the next little detail. Look at verse 19. And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message. So Pilate is on his official seat. He has the leaders gathered around him. He's asked him, do you want me to release a person for you like Barabbas or Jesus? He's asked him that. And then he gets this message from his wife. She sent him a message saying, see that you have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. And notice how Matthew is highlighting Jesus' innocence. Judas regrets what he did because he has betrayed innocent blood. Pilate realizes that it's because of envy they handed him over to him. Here, Pilate's wife calls him a righteous man and says, don't have anything to do with him. And so Matthew, in the way he's telling the story, is helping us see that Jesus really is innocent. And people are acknowledging that throughout this kind of trial sequence. But the chief priests, verse 20, and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. And so we don't just have the leaders here. Now a crowd is beginning to gather around this whole scene in this public kind of outdoor trial moment before Pilate. It's early in the morning. The crowds are up. People are gathered. Rumors have spread about what's happening. And they persuaded the crowds that they should ask for Barabbas and put to death Jesus. And the governor, verse 21, said to them, which of the two do you want me to release for you? And they said, Barabbas. And so now they asked for Barabbas to be released. And we learn from Mark's account that Barabbas was already in prison in connection with revolt and murder. In other words, they chose a known insurrectionist over Jesus. They chose a guilty prisoner over Jesus, which just proves the hypocrisy of their charges. Pilate responds to their request saying, then what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ? And they all said, crucify him. And so now they call out not just the charges, but the desired punishment, crucifixion. That's why they've brought him to Pilate. They can't do that. They need Pilate to do that. And so they now call out what they want done, crucify him. And crucifixion was a punishment the Romans used for the worst of criminals. They used it in places on the outskirts of empire, like here we are in Judea, really kind of in some regards, the fringe of empire. And it was sort of a form of like state terrorism. It was a vicious, brutal form of execution used to humiliate the person who was being killed, as well as execute them, as well as terrorize the local populace. It was a way of saying to anyone else, look what happens when you cross our authority. And that's how the Romans used it, and that's what these people want done to Jesus. Pilate responds by saying, why? What evil has he done? And even here, Pilate acknowledges his innocence. And yet they kept shouting all the more, saying, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And so when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, people were gathering, a crowd was forming, and they were getting emotionally worked up, and he realizes things could get out of control really fast, Pilate took water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. You yourselves shall see to it. You take care of it. And all the people replied, his blood shall be on us and on our children. I always think about Acts chapter 5, verse 28, which is really just a handful of months later, as best as we can tell. And in Acts 5:28, when the apostles challenge the Jewish authorities that you're responsible for killing the Messiah, they protest, say, you're trying to bring this man's blood upon us. But at the moment of crucifixion, they're willing to take that responsibility here in Matthew 27:25. And so Pilate released Barabbas for them. And after having Jesus flogged, he handed him over to be crucified. And in that little statement, we have to realize what an awful experience flogging was. It was being whipped with a multi-strand whip, usually with lead balls or bone fragments or glass fragments in the end of the strands. And it would rip open the flesh and beat down the flesh. In fact, we have reports from the Roman time period of people dying from flogging. And so Pilate has Jesus flogged in a brutal way and then hands him over to be crucified. Then, verse 27, the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, gathered the whole Roman cohort to him. The praetorium is Pilate's palace there in Jerusalem, and the cohort is the on-duty Roman garrison. And so they all gathered together, and they stripped him and put a red cloak on him, and after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, put a reed in his hand, and they knelt down before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And remember, he's already been flogged, so he's been whipped bloody, he's weak, and all of this action here by the Roman garrison is intended as mockery of his supposed royalty. But it emphasizes for us in Matthew's narrative that he was killed for his claim of being the Messiah. In other words, the record of history shows why Jesus was executed. And it wasn't because he was legitimately guilty. It was because he affirmed that indeed he was the Messiah. And so they hail him as King of the Jews, and they spit on him. They took the reed out of his hand, and they beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the cloak off him. They put his own garments back onto him, and they led him out of the praetorium, out of the city, to crucify him. And as they were coming out through the narrow streets of the city, they found a man from Cyrene named Simon, whom they compelled to carry his cross. Now remember, Jesus has been up all night. He's weak from beatings and exhaustion, and he needs help carrying his cross. He can't do it. He's already lost a lot of blood, and so he needs help. And when it says compelled to carry his cross, it's not the whole cross. Not the upright piece and the cross piece, but it's just the cross piece. The upright portion of the cross actually remained out at the place of crucifixion. The piece the condemned person carried was the cross piece that attached to his arms. That's what he needs help carrying. And so they conscript Simon from Cyrene to help carry the cross. And it seems from John's account that Jesus actually started out carrying it. He started out carrying his cross. He just couldn't continue. And so the Romans now have Simon finish carrying it all the way out to the hill where Jesus will be executed. And so as this scene ends, as Matthew has told it, Jesus is clearly innocent, but he's condemned to die for affirming the truth about who he was. He's the Messiah. He's the King, condemned to die. Thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of folks just like you. So thanks a ton for your generous support and for making a difference in the lives of people all around the world through it. And if you have been blessed or impacted in some way by the Listener's Commentary, could I invite you just to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters? As this ministry has grown, we increasingly need more admin help and other kinds of help, and all of that just takes funds to do it. And so if you are able, would you consider setting up a one-time or recurring monthly donation by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page through World Family Mission, my page, and you can put in a dollar amount, click a little box that says Make This Monthly, and set up a donation right there. Thanks a ton for your support.